1965, the Air Force sent this naive Mississippi boy on an adventure he would never forget. Just out of tech school, I really didn't know what to expect from the Air Force or a faraway island called Crete. As the Olympic airliner began its slow descent to the airport at Iraklion, I saw to my left what must be the base where I would spend the next 18 months. The sun had disappeared below the western horizon, and I could see only faint outlines of Crete's mountains. As the DC-6 touched down on the runway, I was anxious about what lay before me in this strange land and what the Air Force had in store for me. Shortly after landing, I found myself riding through a darkened foreign landscape in a '63 VW Beetle, driven by a staff sergeant who introduced himself as Jim. I didn't quite know how to react to this casual interaction since my experience with NCOs had been pretty one-sided. As Jim drove rather recklessly along the narrow road built over the edge of a cliff, I could just make out the dark water below. It was almost pitch black beyond the headlights, except for a few dim lights from small white cottages along the empty road. As we rounded a bend near the base, Jim had to veer around a herd of sheep on the dark roadway, a very common scene as it turned out. When we turned into the base entrance, the air policeman waved us on through without question. This seemed rather odd for a security service base. However, I realized that the APs must be pretty familiar with everyone on this small base, and knew Jim was often tasked with bringing in new airmen in his VW. Jim took a short loop through the darkened base to point out a few places. As we approached one long building with security lights, a guard shack, and a large antenna field in the background, he said, "That's where you'll be working." Turning into a barracks on our left, he said, "This will be your home for a few days until you're assigned to a work flight." Tired and jet-lagged, I collapsed onto the cot in the temporary barracks, missing my new bride and wondering about this dark foreign land. However, the next morning I was greeted with an impressive view of Dia, called Dragon Island, sitting on the calm blue Mediterranean with a cruise ship sailing toward Iraklion. Atop a mountain to the east of the base were giant tropospheric antennas, and to the west the snowy peak of Mount Ida, the island's highest point. After breakfast at the chow hall, I spotted the flag pad where the U.S. and Greek flags flew in unison. The daily retreat ceremony took place here each evening. Just up the hill was the service club, where I would shoot many a game of 8-ball. The base exchange and cafeteria were next on the right, with the base gym next door. Across the street was the base library, a place I was destined to become very familiar with. There were about 7 barracks for airmen, and I wondered which one would be my home when assigned to a flight and work shift. I saw that there were 5 two-storied barracks and 2 newer buildings with 3 floors. Just beyond the barracks were the base medical and dental clinics. On down the street lay the large supply building that provided the base's needs, which were shipped or flown in to the island. The mouse ears looked down upon the base as they transmitted their data. After lunch, which was not half bad, I decided to finish looking around the small base starting at the front gate. Just to the left of the front gate was the base chapel, probably the most attractive building on base. To the right was the AFRTS building.
AFTV Iraklion is operated by personnel assigned to Detachment 4 of the Air Force European Broadcasting.
Just across from AFRTS was the family housing area, where the trailers were separated from the barracks area by a decorative concrete fence. Down the road was the small bus shelter where airmen caught the base bus into town. The electric power plant was next on the left. The base theater seemed to have current movies. The Airmen's Club was another place that would provide a respite from long shifts in the pound. The operations building itself was an imposing windowless building that I could not yet enter while waiting for my top secret clearance to be verified. The activities inside this building were strictly classified, although the large field of antennas in the background hinted as to its purpose. Across the road lay the small headquarters building where the base commander was located. The base fire department sat in the curve across from the flag pad. The next morning I was scheduled to report to the first sergeant at squadron headquarters. The process was less stressful than I had imagined, and I was assigned to Charlie Flight. Charlie Flight resided on the 3rd floor of Barracks 308, one of the newer structures. I soon realized that Charlie Flight was starting mids that night, so my first stint at the pound began at midnight. After walking down to the operations building in the dark, I was relieved to find that my security clearance had gone through and I could enter the compound. As I opened the door to operations, I was surrounded by waves of radio signals coming from within the cavernous space filled with electronic equipment. When that first midnight shift ended the next morning, I was exhausted and understood what the new term bleeding referred to. Soon I was settling into my new surroundings and adjusting to the flurry of activity and the musical dissonance in the barracks. A daily routine was to go by the service club for a quick game of 8-ball, then head out the back door and down a well-worn path to the mailroom for that letter from home. With 24-hour shifts at the compound, the base never really slept, but evenings were still rather quiet and pleasant, with an occasional car and the distant sound of bleating sheep and goats in the hills surrounding the base. A favorite activity after a swing shift at the pound was attending the midnight flick. Emerging from the theater around 3 a.m. to sleep until another swing shift that afternoon. During the evenings when on day shift or long break, many hours were spent on the patio at the Airmen's Club, sipping beer and watching the tourist ships sailing toward Iraklion. Although Iraklion Air Station was an ideal assignment, each evening as we watched the Olympic airliner line up for his landing approach at the airport, we could not help thinking of the day when we would be aboard, heading home once again. The base beach was a great place to soak up the sun, swim, or just walk along the shore. Often, tourist ships would sail between us and Dragon Island. I often wondered what our base looked like from the passenger's viewpoint. As I walked down the breakwater, I arrived at the marina where boats were available for our use. From here, the view of the base was calm and serene. Dragon Island seemed to just beckon us to visit it. So, on a summer afternoon, Jim invited me to take an exploration trip out to the island. As we arrived at the small dock area, I saw that there seemed to be only 2 structures on the island. The population of the island is listed as 2, plus a herd of government-protected Crete goats and 1 cat. The landscape was rocky and rugged, but very suitable for goats. Looking down at the dock where we had tied up the boat, we saw that it was getting late. It was nearly dark as we arrived down at the boat and headed back to the base marina. My roommate and I had been eyeing the mountain just behind the base and wondered what the view of the base was from up there. From our perspective, the mountain appeared to be smooth and gently sloped. As we progressed, we found that the climb was more difficult than we had imagined. The smooth surface we viewed from afar had become rocky and steep. As we neared the peak, we looked down to see what a small footprint our base made on the surrounding landscape. On the mountain to the west, overlooking the base, there was a 30-foot cross erected as a joint statement of cooperation between the U.S. Air Force and the people of Crete. It seems that Jim had connections with a Greek pilot who flew a helicopter around the island. He arranged for us to be coptered up to the tropo site on the mountain to the east of the base. As we sat down on the landing pad at the tropo site, we saw that there were the ever-present goats and sheep even up there. Walking to the edge of the mountain, we looked up at the giant twin tropospheric antennas looking down on the small base. We had now visited the peaks of 3 mountains surrounding the base. After summer, I discovered that Crete is not all sunshine and blue water. Winters were often wet and cold. Even a walk to the chow hall could be wet and unpleasant, and the walk to the pound for a mid-shift in the cold rain was quite miserable. The beach was no longer the bright and active place we had known all summer. As spring approached, so did the winds from the Sahara Desert, bringing the dust storms that rendered the atmosphere a hazy orange. The operations compound was the heart of the base and its reason for being. The Air Force Security Service was established during the Cold War era under the National Security Agency to intercept, collect, and analyze electronic data from around the world. This windowless, secure building operated around the clock, intercepting electronic messages with the latest 1960s era equipment. Each of these silent warriors had a top-secret clearance and was sworn to silence. Security was paramount. At the end of each shift, all physical evidence of these collections were destroyed in the burn room incinerator. Now, more than 50 years later, these activities have been declassified and replaced with digital technology. But most veterans of the era are still hesitant to discuss them even today. For most airmen, the familiar Blue Goose was our form of transportation. Taking us into Iraklion to experience the unique Greek culture, history, and cuisine. To Knossos, the palace of the Minoan age in 3000 BC, and into the mountain villages where we were welcomed with friendliness and apprehension. In September of 1966, I began Xing out the last days on my short sheet. I realized I had the Figmo syndrome, but began looking back over the past 18 months. I had many experiences that I would never forget. Jim offered to take me to the airport where he had picked me up a year and a half ago. I realized on that ride that my view of Crete had changed greatly since I took that first dark and dreary ride to the base long before. As we turned into the airport, I felt a mixture of great excitement and sadness. As the Olympic airliner lifted off and Iraklion began to recede, I peered out the window to my right to see Iraklion Air Station sliding past below, and knew that it was unlikely that I would ever see it again. But I was headed home at last, and back to my bride, who I had to leave a few months after our wedding. Crete would be a place I would never forget, and my bride is still at my side after 57 years.